Hello, in this video we will discuss civil rights organizations. In some of the videos in this module and the readings that are included in the module, you will see and hear the names and acronyms of civil rights organizations being used. And I just want to provide some context and just talk about the ways in which these organizations speak to each other. At the bottom of this slide, you will see a little chart that I have created to kind of provide a guide for us in terms of the dispositions or the attitudes of the civil rights organizations that are included in this presentation. So as it relates to the organizations, you'll see that SNCC on the left is the most progressive of the civil rights organizations included in the materials today. And then we have the Urban League on the right end as the most conservative. There isn't a lot of information about the Urban League in the readings in this module. However, we will talk about it just a little bit today. We're going to go chronologically, so the order of the presentation will not follow the flow of the timeline, of the chart that you see at the bottom, but you'll understand. So, in terms of the earliest of the organizations participating in the civil rights struggle, we see the NAACP. So the NAACP started as a part of the Niagara movement and with influences from abolitionists. So you'll see here that the NAACP was established in 1910. That is around the turn of the century. That is not far from the end of Reconstruction in 1877. And we know that the period after Reconstruction, there was intense violence and intimidation on the part of whites in terms of their efforts to maintain the status quo. So we see that the NAACP emerged around the turn of the century to, number one, try to address some of those concerns about violence and intimidation, but also just to help move the conversation forward about African Americans and full citizenship. One of the things that we didn't have the opportunity to discuss in the Free Black Community module was the distinctions between the ideologies of W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington. So Du Bois is one who valued formal education in the letters and humanities and sociology, etc. And then we have Booker T. Washington, who believed that African Americans needed to learn how to live off of the land, that they needed a skill, a trade, to be able to earn those funds or earn money to have a decent life. One of the things that Du Bois says is, let us be one, the fingers of the hand, as it relates to all things mutual to progress, but let us be separate as the fingers as it relates to things purely social. And so what the NAACP did was step in and really work to, counter Booker T. Washington's argument and promote a different type of academic or traditionally scholarly, palatable acquisition of skills. So to get a college education in humanities or liberal arts would be something that the NAACP would advocate for. And a part of that is because the NAACP focused on litigation and legislation, so understanding the law, which required literacy, and something that, we come to understand through looking at the efforts to keep Blacks away from voting and the implementation of literacy tests. Also, one of the characteristics of the NAACP is that it is a bureaucratic organization with a central committee. There was not a lot of input from the masses with regards to how the NAACP would be run. Basically, they set the agenda organized the drives and things, and the masses followed the NAACP. In terms of the values or the commitments of the NAACP, they were litigation, legislation, and education. One of the things that you will come to see, and I'm sure you already know, that the NAACP was heavily involved in the Brown versus Board of Education. So we see here how litigation, legislation, and education go together, wherein the NAACP is supporting blacks and supporting those who have sued their states and the government for lack of access and quality education. What they're doing is challenging Plessy v. Ferguson, right, and advocating for new legislation that will provide opportunities for African Americans or blacks to receive an equitable and well, an equal education. So, in terms of their where they stand on the line, the NAACP is a more conservative organization, and that is because of its central governance and its focus on these litigation, legislation, and education issues. We'll move on to the Urban League. So we're still down on the right-hand side, the conservative area of our graphic. So the Urban League was established in 1911 and grew out of a number of organizations. Basically, the Urban League focused on social and economics, social and economic conditions of African Americans. So they're really interested in issues of job development, because jobs build communities, communities build cities, cities build states. And so what they're saying is that African Americans need an opportunity to contribute to their local communities and thus the national gross domestic product. And the Urban League worked to eliminate barriers to getting those jobs and establishing wealth for African Americans. And so one of the things that you'll see here is developing alliances with white businessmen. This is one of the reasons why the Urban League is down on the right end of the graphic, because they believe the traditional notions of what it means or what is required to achieve upward mobility. So the Urban League was not very radical. The Urban League was not pushing back, so to speak, against racist notions or stereotypes about African Americans. What they were trying to do was to teach African Americans how to get the jobs to be able to build the wealth that others had. Okay, CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality. We talked a little bit about CORE in the overview video. So CORE is one of the more progressive civil rights organizations, and it was founded by Quakers and Episcopalians during World War II. And basically what CORE did was test out the federal courts. So one of the biggest initiatives of CORE was the Freedom Rides. And in the Freedom Rides, what they were doing was testing the Supreme Court decision that outlawed segregation on buses that were traveling on the interstates. And so it's a radical thing to put whites and blacks on a bus, to put whites at the back of the bus, and travel down the interstates from the north to the south and just test and see if the South would be able to hold the Supreme Court's laws. And one of the things that we know was that the South was not. When these buses arrived in the South, those who were on the buses were brutally, brutally harmed. In addition to things like the Freedom Rides and testing Supreme Court law, the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, they also focused on voter registration. As with many other civil rights organizations, nonviolence was certainly a philosophy that they abided by. In addition to nonviolence, the Congress of Racial Equality also valued direct action. That's something that we see in the Freedom Rides. And in addition to engaging in showcases of direct action, they also did things that are akin to the Black Panther Party and published and distributed comic books on civil disobedience. And so, one of the things that we haven't talked about as much is the use of comic books during this era. I think, in terms of excuse me, visual and written representations, comic books were very useful in helping African Americans understand what these different organizations were trying to do to enhance and bring an end to the movement by achieving racial equality, by achieving voting rights, by achieving an end to discrimination. So, CORE, down on the more progressive end. Then we have the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. This organization, SCLC, we consider it to be a moderate organization when it comes to progressive and conservative ideology. Southern Christian Leadership Conference is the conference that was highly influenced by the work of Dr. King and was led in some ways by Dr. King. It is also the conference that Ella Baker criticized in her move to SNCC, and we'll talk about SNCC next. But the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, as suggested in their name, was steeped in the Black church, used a lot of ministers as the core of leadership. It was based in the South, and it used strategies like mass mobilization, preaching, and movement music. If you think about it, it really makes sense. When you have Black ministers who are serving as leaders, particularly in the South, they are speaking and using liberatory or liberation theology to mobilize their churches and congresses or districts of churches. And oftentimes, as with church services or spiritual movements, music was used to kind of galvanize the people, to provide a sense of urgency and hope and inspiration in getting involved in the movement. And like the NAACP, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference also had a very centralized governing committee. This is one of the critiques of Ella Baker. And students, college students, who were initially participating in SCLC. So in 1960, a group of college students who were participating in sit-ins in North Carolina, formed the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee under the advisorship of Ella Baker. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, like the NAACP, like the SCLC, they value nonviolent philosophy as protest. However, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee also believed in self-defense. So in some ways, you'll see down here nationalism. This should say anti-war, independent political organizing nationalism. You'll see nationalism here because SNCC did kind of make a move towards an even more radical Black nationalist stance. SNCC, as you see in the Ella Baker piece, was opposed to a strong centralized government. Ella Baker believed that strong people don't need strong leaders. Strong people just need to be given an opportunity and space to speak for themselves and organize around their own issues. And so we see a model of group-centered leadership emerging with SNCC. SNCC is the party of Fannie, or the organization of Fannie Lou Hamer. When she's talking about these students and these young people that she's working with in the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, these young people that she's working with to try to help get people registered to vote and try to bring the elder generations along in understanding the sentiments of Black power and not in resisting assimilation at the expense of civil rights. These are the types of things that she's talking about. SNCC was anti-war. You'll see, I mean, it's a bunch of students who are susceptible to the draft. They are not interested in going into war and believe in non-violence. And so we see that with the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. SNCC is not necessarily a Republican or Democratic organization. They don't espouse to those values. What they really believe in is the people articulating their issues and organizing around their own issues. And so we have it. The five civil rights organizations that were most visible during the time. Of course, there were others, but these are the ones that we hear about most often and are included in the materials for this module. Let me know if you have questions. Hit me on the email or in the discussion board.